Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can I share screen? Thank you very much, Jane, for your introduction. Thank you very much to Alex for inviting me for this talk. I'm very happy to be here. Very happy to see everyone. I really miss everyone because of the COVID-19. We can't meet in person. Okay, but I hope we can eventually get over this and come to meet again in the future. Okay. So today my talk is about Deleuze and the shame of writing. Okay, and is there any better reason to write? This is partly kind of a self-reflection due to COVID-19 pandemic. I was asking myself, what is the point of writing? What is the point of philosophy if it seems so helpless in the age of COVID-19 and pandemic? And I was also at the same time writing about shame, because Alex invited me to write a paper about shame. So I was thinking along the lines of shame and guilt as a scholar, because I see many people being unemployed because of the COVID-19 and many people dying. So this is in a way my way of dealing with the question of why should I continue to write? And so I stopped for a while, okay, and this is part of my comeback writing, right, to find a reason for writing. Okay, so let me begin. Okay, so in essays, critical and clinical, Deleuze asks, is there any better reason to write? This statement occurs in the context of his reflection of the shame of being a man. In making this statement, Deleuze seems to have raised doubt with regards to the purpose of writing itself, just like me in the age of a global pandemic. This is possible since post-war thinkers expressed similar doubts in the face of the barbarity of war and a deep sense of crisis and complicity in the exercise of reason. This interpretation, however, runs counter to the overall trajectory of Deleuze's thought. In this paper, it is my contention that Deleuze understood shame differently from his contemporaries, and that his reflections provide us with a reason for continuing to philosophize and to continue writing. We will examine Deleuze's idea of shame by way of contrast with three thinkers, Adorno, Hannah Arendt, and Agamben's idea of shame, which together fundamentally sees it as a negative event, before we unpack Deleuze's idea of shame, which serves as a reason for writing. Okay, let me change the slide a little bit. Okay. A common theme among philosophers since the post-Auschwitz era is whether philosophy is still possible and whether writing is still possible in the age of inhuman barbarity and crisis and catastrophes. If there is anything that characterized post-war philosophies, it is that they wrote in response to one of the most significant events in human history, namely Auschwitz. Historians like to give us numbers, but numbers tend to hide the horrors that occurred behind the walls of the camps, what Agamben would call biopolitics. The mere mention of the term, however, should immediately conjures up images of the Nazis systematically eliminating thousands of Jewish people in concentration camps with little or no remorse. This event affected the European thinkers right up to the 60s and even 70s, and can also be found in Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy, specifically in the idea that we are condemned to be free, if only because we cannot shake off the responsibility. While many European thinkers and writers felt the responsibility to engage in a critique of the event of Auschwitz, however, they also found themselves in a precarious position because the demand to critique the event was also accompanied by what could be called an aesthetic of failure. That is, the experience that such a critique is bound for failure simply because of its complicity. If there was one thinker who could best characterize this post-Auschwitz perspective of writing, it would have to be Adorno. Adorno's impressions on the barbarity of Auschwitz in a number of writings, such as Towards a New Categorical Imperative, Damaged Life and Administered World Reified Thought, which is published in a volume called Can One Live After Auschwitz, 2009, served as a common reference point for many intellectuals from this period. The precariousness of philosophical critique in writing, the whole meaning of it lies in the fact that such a critique is absolutely necessary in a world devastated by what Horkheimer, in his Eclipse of Reason, would call instrumental reason. And yet, such a task, though necessary, seems to be impossible because such a critique must be based on a form of reason which is also somehow responsible for or even complicit in the slaughter of millions of Jews. In Adorno's works, we find that he was constantly struggling with his own condemnation of Auschwitz when he recognizes that his own references to Auschwitz are themselves acts of representations which may reduce and vulgarize the horrendous barbarism that occurred behind the walls of the concentration camps. Hence, Adorno's apparent ban on writing, and specifically poetry, with his statement, "Is poetry possible?" Adorno would even go to the extent of suggesting that the real corrosiveness of Auschwitz does not lie in his having made poetry impossible. Rather, the real damage that it has done is in perversely turning Auschwitz into something that perversely makes us believe that we have understood the event, that we have domesticated the event. This is aligned with Adorno's overall philosophy in his negative dialectics, that ideas tend to become ossified when circulating in theoretical and intellectual circles, and that it will begin to operate as an inhibition to real thinking and understanding of the event. The haunting image of Auschwitz also figures prominently in the thought of Hannah Arendt. In Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, she engages in a post-Auschwitz reflection over the origins of totalitarianism and the silence of intellectuals over Auschwitz. Arendt considers the task of thought to lie in the discovery of hidden mechanics of fascism, the mechanics whereby the traditional elements of our political and spiritual world were dissolved into a conglomeration where everything seems to have lost specific value. And furthermore, it has become unrecognizable for human comprehension, unusable for human purpose. Arendt argues that what emerged in the aftermath of Auschwitz was the unprecedented rise of a form of totalitarian and fascist power that is able to systematically plan and carry out extermination campaigns to thousands of people without the slightest trace of moral remorse. However, even as Arendt engages in the critique of the event of Auschwitz, she is not unaware of the sense of irony and complicity of such a critique. This is why in Origins of Totalitarianism, when Arendt referred to the 1914 to 18 war in Europe as an event that is almost impossible to describe. She makes it known clearly in the remarkable moment of self-awareness and irony that while she's engaged in a critique of this event, she is also simultaneously representing and participating in this unspeakable event. In fact, in a way that parallels Adorno's reflections on poetry of the Auschwitz, Arendt would say that even the truest of speech would be as inaccurate as are all the others. Arendt rejects the idea of collective guilt as a way of escaping responsibility and suggests that shame would be a more appropriate alternative. Guilt is an experience, according to Arendt, that is specific to an individual, and it is always linked to a specific victim or victims that the individual has harmed. She wants to make this distinction in order to raise the point that confessions of guilt by leaders of a collective over their past misdeeds, when they do not have such a relationship, are always inappropriate and self-indulgent. Such confessions of guilt whitewashes the unspeakable that has been inflicted by the perpetrators on the victims. In Responsibility and Judgment, Arendt states that guilt, unlike responsibility, always singles out. It is strictly personal. It refers to an act, not intentions or potentialities. It is only in a metaphorical sense that we can say we feel guilty for the sins of our fathers or our people or mankind. In short, for deeds we have not done, although the course of event may have made us pay for them, unquote. In fact, feelings of guilt do not guarantee that one has done the misdeed. There are many examples of oppressed individuals who are more prone to guilt than that about things that they have not done at all. Frantz Fanon's account of the oppressed, for instance, highlights the hidden guilt of those who were oppressed. In fact, in the case of post-colonial societies, there is developed sometime in what is called a survival guilt, when one survived the atrocities or when one escaped mass execution by live firing squads, while one's comrades lay in the fields lifeless. Heron argues that shame is more appropriate in cases of collective responsibility. She writes, "For the idea of humanity, when purged of all sentimentality, has the very serious consequence that in one form and another, man must assume responsibility for all crimes committed by men, and that all nations share the onus of evil committed by all others. Shame at being a human being is the purely individual and non-political expression of this insight. Instead of guilt, then, Aaron argues that shame would be a more appropriate response." Agamben shares Aaron's view that collective guilt is often used by political leaders as a way to avoid responsibility. Agamben's reflections on shame shares an affinity with Primo Levi and Robert Entham's works, but he notes that Levi's works reflect a shame that is not only without guilt, but also without time. This is a sense in which the sense of shame is timeless, or a sense in which there is no temporal delimitations to whence the shame began or whence it can end. In Remnants of Auschwitz, Agamben writes, "This renders it into something that is more than mere psychic shame and makes it ontological shame." Agamben's reflections on Robert Entham's descriptions of shame in Remnants of Auschwitz are also worth turning to. Entham's first Italian man, when he's picked up to be killed at random, tells of a different shame, not the shame of having to live while one's friends die, but the shame of having to die. Agamben claims that shame is the hidden structure of consciousness, and this means being consigned to a passivity that cannot be assumed. In concluding his discussion, Agamben finds that subjectification and desubjectification are basic to subjectivity, meaning that subjectivity is really shame. Flush is the remainder that in every subjectification betrays a desubjectification, and that in every desubjectification bears witness to a subject. The blush shows the paradoxical nature of subjectivity and language, according to Agamben, that when I try to speak, I reveal that there is no solid subject, but at the same time attempts to prevent speech or to dehumanize a human being at the same time. Agamben argues that the subject cannot speak, as they are identified with the event of discourse rather than their subjectivity. Thus, shame is articulated by Agamben as the human being's basic mode of attunement because it reveals our condition in relation to subjectivity and speech. In the post-Auschwitz era, philosophical writings are apparently defined by the profound sense of complicity. European intellectuals and writers from Adorno to Agamben have incessantly ruminated on the events of Auschwitz and questions not only the status of man, the status of Enlightenment reason, but also on the meaning of writing itself in an age of barbarity. They seem to be gathered in saying that some of the most profound kinds of shame are experienced as involuntary and thus not subject to intellectual appeasement. It is the involuntary, painful, and intolerable affective power of shame that makes it so violent and makes the experience of it so problematizing for individuals. In the face of these involuntary shame, philosophers and writers usually adopt one of the following three strategies for survival. Number one either falls under the weight of this shame and further transform it into a sense of crippling guilt, or number two, one begins to submerge it using existing theories and beliefs in order to preserve the image of one's decency before one's own sense of shame, or number three, one intensifies the experience of shame, problematizes one's sense of shame, and becomes actively revolutionary and otherwise. It is a contention that while most thinkers and writers in the 20th century adopted the first strategy, Deleuze adopted the last strategy. Deleuze's references to Primo Levi may give us the impression that he agrees that shame is a negative experience. The shame of being a man, is a phrase that Deleuze associates with Levi's The Drowned and the Saved. It refers to an experience of having been sullied or dirtied by Nazism. He recounts Primo Levi's in Le Bercader having returned alive from Nazi extermination camps, where Levi had written about his profound sense of shame in the Nazi death camps. The shame that comes to one when the other, usually my friend, looks at me. While the other, usually my friend, here obviously refers to those who are about to die. Levi, like Aaron, insists that this is different from simply admitting that we are guilty. To begin with, Deleuze shares the idea that shame has no relation to guilt. The difference between shame and guilt is that whereas guilt will presuppose an ontology of the subject, shame is the experience of the subject's dissolution and its complicity. In fact, for Deleuze, the usefulness of this concept can only be measured precisely by its distance from guilt. In Charles Stivell's Gilles Deleuze ABCs, it is said that Deleuze feels that we should not be made to believe this, that there should be no assimilating the executioners with the victims. So the shame of being a man does not mean that we are all the same or that we are all compromised. It means several things. A very complex feeling, not unified. It means at once, how could some humans, Deleuze insists, that is other than me, do that? And second, how have I nevertheless taken sides? Deleuze says this does not mean that one has become an executioner, but still one took sides in order to have survived. And there is a certain shame in having survived in the place of friends who did not survive. While reading these statements, Deleuze seems to have joined the philosophers in condemning the events of Auschwitz. This interpretation of shame, however, raises a question because it is clearly antithetical to the overall trajectory of Deleuze's philosophy, which is directed at immanence and joyful passions. His three classic volumes on Spinoza, namely Spinoza, Practical Philosophy, Expressionism in Philosophy, and Pure Immanence, Essays in a Life, should leave us with no doubt as to the overall Spinozian and Nietzschean trajectory of his philosophy. This suggests that we need to rethink the interpretation of Deleuze's statement in Essays in Critical and Clinical, that is there any better reason to write as an injunction not to write. Although Deleuze is deeply moved by Levi's account of shame, he does not seem to have shared the same crippling reservations about philosophy and the possibility of writing. In What is Philosophy, Deleuze states that the feeling of shame is one of philosophy's most powerful motives. And in negotiations, sorry, I need to change my slides. Okay. So this means that for Deleuze, shame should not be the reason for giving up, but the basis for a new kind of writing that should take place in the name of the powerless. The powerless here are those for whom no names exist, for whom ontology has not created a space. To speak for the powerless then, for the subaltern, for the illiterate, for the mute, is not to speak on their behalf or in their place, but to speak, to be responsible before them. This reflects a fundamental difference between Deleuze's conception of philosophy and shame and that of his predecessor. If the role of philosophy was to use a series of arguments, was understood in an analytical tradition to refer to the using arguments that lead inevitably from premises to conclusions, for Deleuze, the role of philosophy is to bring about feelings of shame and to sadden those who are stupid. Secondly, shame also provides an opportunity for self-critique. In Deleuze's philosophy, the philosophical function of saddening is not merely aimed at the powers that be, but directly at ourselves, inasmuch as the powers that be and all of those ossified stupidities which they induce run through us. Some of these stupidities that run through us, some of these powers, like capitalism, public opinion, television, thought of the market, Deleuze argues that these do not exist outside of ourselves, but inside us. Since our stupidities aren't just external things, but permeate each of us, philosophy throws us into a constant negotiations with and a guerrilla campaign against ourselves. Shame in Deleuze, in What is Philosophy, he stated that shame is what exists for the shameful compromises with our time that we undergo, and for the absence of any sure way of maintaining becomings, or still more of arousing them even within ourselves. Indeed, Deleuze would even go to the extent of saying that we do not feel ourselves outside of our time, but continue to undergo a shameful compromises with it. When Deleuze writes that we can feel shame at being human in utterly trivial situations in the face of too great a vulgarization of thinking, in the face of TV entertainment and of jolly people gossiping, it is only because such shameful situations are or become one's own. They implicate one's own stupidities. Thus, Deleuze regards shame as a powerful precondition for problematizing oneself, one's own stupidities, and he endorses it as one of philosophy's most powerful motives for harming stupidity. Thirdly, Deleuze's idea of shame is also associated with the positive function of writing and becoming. In writing, one becomes woman, becomes animal or vegetable, becomes molecule to the point of becoming imperceptible. In in an interview with Antonio Negri, Deleuze even says man's only hope lies in a revolutionary becoming, the only way of casting off their shame or responding to what is intolerable. Thus, the recognition of shame is not an ethics that's predicated upon the obligation of the self towards the other. It is an occasion in which the ontological entity of the self may begin to be vacated entirely. Such labor begins with the stupidity that runs through us and proves to be no longer tolerable, and one feels ashamed of it. Shame is able to bring about a sort of violence to oneself and a saddening of oneself that enables oneself to think otherwise. It is a violent, harmful, and saddening affective power of shame which forces one to problematize oneself and to become. And thus, the problematization of these stupidities that one encounters in the world must always be matched with a problematization of one's own stupidities, inasmuch as one internalizes the stupidities of our time. This problematization is important for Deleuze because he considers it a right to problems, to be a power that is supplement to the role of shame for harming stupidity. A right to problems means the right to create problems here and now so as to individuate oneself. It is therefore means it therefore means the right to create oneself by problematizing oneself. If stupidity is in as much a collective of our time as it is a personal event, then the problematization of stupidity can occur both in outward critiques of its most harmful tendencies and at the level of our own personal singular stupidities. This is why Deleuze writes, if thought thinks only when constrained or forced to think so, it remains stupid so long as nothing forces it to think. Is it not also the existence of stupidity which forces it to think? In conclusion, Deleuze's concept of shame invites us to think of shame in a different and more positive way. While it is important to recognize the shame of certain historical events, we should also avoid its crippling effects. The denial of responsibility and the crippling sense of responsibility are both alike in that they both mask and vulgarizes because they reveal the non-recognition of that which is intolerable. Indeed, in an age of COVID-19 and global pandemic, and who knows when it will end, Deleuze might invite us, if he were here, to depart from our own sense of shame, much less guilt at being helpless, insignificant, and complicit. He would invite us to use this shame to philosophize, and to philosophize in a way that shames stupidities, our own stupidities, and to write even more and to think even more and to fulfill our task of becoming. Thank you very much.